I live in a very secluded area, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, where the land stretches wide and open. About a 15-minute walk from my home, there's an expansive field with 2 lakes. Beyond them stands an old, abandoned estate. The estate has always been shrouded in mystery, surrounded by eerie stories and whispers of strange happenings. Some claim to have seen shadowy figures moving around it or slipping inside. Curiosity got the best of us, and 2 years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go camping near the estate at night. We wanted to see for ourselves if the stories held any truth. We planned everything carefully and agreed to meet at the entrance of the field at 7 p.m. At first, we were in high spirits, cracking jokes and laughing about what we might find. The idea of exploring the abandoned estate filled us with excitement and a sense of adventure. However, as we ventured further and the sun began to dip below the horizon, the mood shifted. The lively atmosphere faded into an eerie stillness, the only sound being the dry autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. The deeper we walked, the more uncertain we became. Doubt crept in. Should we keep going? The estate wasn't just deserted. It was crumbling, its walls scorched and covered in unsettling graffiti. It stood eerily alone in the vast emptiness, forgotten and decayed. By the time we arrived near the estate, darkness had completely settled in. Everything around us felt unnaturally silent. Then we noticed something or someone. At first, it seemed like a person standing roughly 200 meters away. In the dim light, we could barely make out its features, but something about it felt off. The moment we laid eyes on it, the figure moved in a way that defied all logic. It closed the distance between us far too quickly, faster than any human could. We stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Then one of my friends went pale, his face filled with sheer horror. He screamed for us to run, his voice raw with panic. The terror in his eyes sent shivers down my spine. I turned to look behind us, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing there was a tall, humanoid figure, easily towering over 6 feet. But its height wasn't what terrified me. It was the way it had approached. It had moved with absolute silence. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, no warning. Without thinking, we ran. Our instincts took over, and we bolted as if our lives depended on it. And maybe they did. My friends were ahead of me. One was athletic and sprinted with ease, but the other, who was shorter and not as fast, struggled to keep up. As for me, I had a heart condition that made running difficult, and I felt my legs beginning to give out. My slower friend and I exchanged terrified glances, the same grim thought flashing through our minds. This might be the end. But sheer survival instinct kicked in. Fear fueled our strength in ways we didn't know were possible. What had taken us half an hour to walk now took mere minutes to escape. We didn't dare look back until we reached the lakes. That's when we finally glanced over our shoulders, and what we saw made our blood run cold. The figure had stopped near a small dam. Then, right before our eyes, it twisted and contorted in an unnatural way, shifting from a tall humanoid form to something that dropped onto 4 legs. In an instant, the creature sprinted away into the shadows, vanishing into the night. By the time we reached the neighborhood, we were out of breath, screaming and crying in terror. A security guard rushed to us, alarmed by our state. He could see the fear in our faces, the way we trembled. Though we could barely form words, he knew something terrible had happened. He led us to the nearest house, where we tried to calm down, but even now, the memory of that night haunts us. In the days that followed, a heavy sense of unease lingered over us, as if something unseen was watching. To this day, just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. Some mysteries, I believe, are better left unsolved. Even now, years later, I still get shivers thinking about it. Every summer, my family spent a week at this remote, peaceful place called Cedar Hollow Lake. It wasn't a popular vacation spot, just a small, weathered cabin, a dock, and water stretching into an endless expanse of dense forest. No nearby houses, no other campers, just us, surrounded by trees. I used to adore that place. It felt like our own hidden world. But after that summer, none of us wanted to return. One morning, my sisters and I decided to drift across the lake on some old rubber tubes. The air was thick with fog, rolling over the water in slow, curling wisps. From the dock, you could barely make out the opposite shore, just the dark silhouettes of trees pressing against the mist. They had been floating for nearly an hour when suddenly, they came sprinting back, crashing through the cabin door, soaking wet, breathless, shaking, faces drained of all color. It took them a minute to even form words, and when they did, it made no sense. They told us they had seen something on the distant shoreline. At first, they thought it was a dog, low to the ground, perfectly still, watching them. But then it stood up, and it wasn't a dog anymore. It was pale, almost sickly white, and it moved in a way that was all wrong, like a puppet with tangled strings. It swayed, shifting from side to side, its movements twitchy and unnatural. Then, suddenly, it turned its head and locked eyes with them. But its eyes, they weren't glowing, they weren't reflecting light. They were just deep, empty pits. And then, in one motion, it dropped onto all fours and bolted into the forest. They were hysterical by the time they finished explaining. My dad, who never got shaken by anything, sat there in silence for a long moment, rubbing his chin. Finally, he told them to stay put and not go near the water for the rest of the day. He didn't say it, but I could tell he believed them. A few nights later, we were all trying to act normal, but tension still lingered. Even the campfire didn't feel warm that night. By midnight, we had all retreated into the tent. The woods were eerily quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. I don't know how long we lay there before we heard the footsteps. At first, they were soft, slow, somewhere out in the trees. Then they got closer, deliberate, circling the tent. I barely breathed, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst. My dad, who was lying closest to the entrance, sat up slowly. Then it stopped. Everything was dead silent. And then, just beyond the thin fabric of the tent, a low growl. Not like a dog, not like a bear, something else, something that shouldn't have been there. My dad didn't hesitate. He grabbed his half-empty beer bottle and hurled it into the darkness. For a second, nothing, just the sound of glass shattering. Then something threw a piece of it back. I swear, something hurled a shard of broken glass straight at us. It sliced clean through the tent and cut my sister's arm. She screamed, clutching it as blood dripped down her skin. Then the footsteps started again. Faster this time. Not running away, running around us, circling, again and again. We didn't move. We didn't speak. We just huddled in that tent, shaking, counting the hours until the sun finally rose. The second daylight hit, we packed up and got the hell out of there. My dad didn't say a word, just drove. I remember looking back at the tree line as we pulled away, half expecting to see something standing there, watching us leave. But there was nothing. My sister still has the scar from where the glass cut her. A thin, jagged mark down her forearm. I don't care what anyone says. People think it was just an animal or the mist playing tricks on us, or our minds running wild. But I know what we saw, what we heard, and the scar my sister carries proves it. We weren't alone that night at Cedar Hollow Lake. During the lockdown, I found myself watching endless YouTube videos of people camping outdoors, admiring breathtaking views of the wilderness from the Andes to the Arctic. As my birthday approached, I decided to escape the city and visit a nature reserve. I live in Calvo, and the city has several nature reserves open to visitors, but due to restrictions, my choices were limited. Luckily, I had some connections that allowed me to enter the Akinori National Reserve. I won't go into too much detail, but let's just say I didn't take the usual route in. The last time I had been there, something strange happened that left me wondering if I had experienced something supernatural. That curiosity led me and 3 of my friends to plan a camping trip in the reserve, hoping for a change of scenery and fresh air. However, from the moment we arrived, my excitement waned. It wouldn't stop raining. Although we were prepared for the rain, we hadn't expected the way the thick fog mixed with it. severely limiting our visibility. It made it nearly impossible to appreciate the beauty of our surroundings. After spending the morning walking along the trail, following it as best as we could, I realized how easy it would be to get lost there. That thought unsettled me a little. But then, around 1 in the afternoon, the sky finally cleared, revealing the breathtaking Eerie Lagoon. Encircled by a stunning landscape, the place had a mystique about it. Anyone who has been there knows how the shifting fog moves over the land like a living thing. Beams of sunlight pierced through the remaining clouds, illuminating an incredible variety of native plants. Felt like the perfect birthday gift. That's when things started getting strange. As I observed the scenery more closely, I noticed something odd. The path's surface wasn't muddy at all. It was as if the heavy rain we had just endured had never touched it. Puzzled, I glanced around, trying to see if the rain had simply moved past us. To my surprise, the storm clouds appeared to be circling the lagoon rather than moving away. I pointed it out to one of my friends, and she casually mentioned that this kind of phenomenon was more common than one might think. She said similar things happened near Lari Airport and that this was why the airport had been built in that location. I had never heard of that before, but I accepted the explanation. As long as there weren't frogs or snakes falling from the sky, I was content to enjoy myself. We spent the afternoon eating and talking about everything: life during lockdown, working from home, family, and all the struggles we had faced recently. But there was one thing I was waiting for someone to bring up: the faceless woman I had seen at Omei the last time I visited. And sure enough, my friend, the one with the airport theory, was the one to ask about it. "This place is beautiful, but I can't imagine how a woman could be out here in just a dress," she said. "It's freezing," I replied. "I know what I saw, believe me or don't, but honestly, I'd rather not talk about it. We're having a good time." For a few minutes, they joked about how it was probably just an abandoned mannequin or that I had been high and imagined it. We laughed it off, and I suggested we cut the cake since it was getting late. We sang happy birthday, and everything was going fine, until we noticed an echo. At first, it seemed like the landscape was bouncing our voices back at us, so we kept singing. But then my stomach dropped. It wasn't an echo, it was humming. Someone was trying to remember the tune, hesitating in certain places, almost as if struggling to recall the words. I immediately tried to locate the source of the sound, but I couldn't. It felt as though whoever was humming was standing right next to us, but we couldn't see them. When I snapped out of it, I told my friends we should leave. That's when one of them pointed toward the lagoon. There she was, a figure dressed in black, standing right by the water's edge. I wasn't afraid. It felt more like spotting a long-lost acquaintance. Someone who had been away for years, or maybe like I was the one who had been away and was finally back. Only my friend and I could see her, but everyone heard the humming, as if she were right there with us. That was enough to send shivers down everyone's spine. Without wasting time, we quickly packed our things and left the reserve, heading back to Calvo. On the way back, my friends were visibly shaken by what had happened, but my male friend remained completely silent, his face pale. When we dropped everyone off, I asked if he was okay. I told him it wasn't a big deal, just a woman standing there, looking normal in my opinion. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "No normal woman has no feet," he muttered. "That thing didn't. They just weren't there." That was when the fear finally hit me. We never talked about it again. We had been camping deep in the woods near Pine Hollow, Wyoming, about 20 miles down a dirt path with no one else around. No rangers, no other campers, just endless forest stretching in every direction. First, everything was perfect. My wife, my brother-in-law, and I, along with our 3 nephews, ages 4, 7, and 9, spent our time hiking, fishing, playing games, and gazing at the stars. Our dogs ran freely, loving the open space. But everything changed on the second night. Around 6 p.m., the dogs, normally energetic and playful, suddenly grew uneasy. Their fur bristled as they paced along the edge of our campsite, staring into the trees. Every so often, One of them would let out a deep, throaty growl. We figured they had caught the scent of a bear or possibly a cougar. This was deep wilderness after all, but we weren't too concerned. That night, the adults sat around the fire long after the kids had gone to sleep. The air was thick and heavy, eerily still. I've camped my entire life, and I know the usual sounds of the forest at night. The rustling of tiny creatures, the distant hoots of owls. But that night, the woods were completely silent. Worse than that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. It wasn't just in my head. It was that deep, primal instinct telling me that eyes were fixed on us from somewhere unseen. When we finally crawled into our tents, I struggled to sleep. Every time I started to drift off, a faint noise, a twig snapping, the shuffle of leaves, jolted me awake. I told myself it was just an animal, but it didn't feel like one. The next morning, we found 2 of our 5-gallon water jugs completely empty. They hadn't tipped over, and the ground wasn't wet, just drained. The boys might have messed with them, or maybe there was a slow leak, but my gut told me otherwise. By midday, the air was thick with unease. Even the kids, normally full of energy, were quieter than usual. The dogs remained on edge, sniffing frantically, running ahead on the trail like they were searching for something we couldn't see. That's when we decided we were leaving first thing in the morning. We weren't panicked, but something felt off. The woods just felt wrong. It wasn't until that evening that we realized we'd waited too long. By the time we were packed up, the sun was sinking below the treetops. The boys begged for one last adventure before we left, a snipe hunt. We agreed. There was still an hour of daylight left, and it was supposed to be a harmless game. I trailed behind the group, occasionally tossing a rock into the bushes to make them think a snipe was near. We were maybe 5 minutes from camp when a rock, about the size of 2 fists, came hurling out of the trees. It barely missed one of my nephews. We all turned, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing. Then, another rock. This one hit me square in the back. The other adults stared at me, waiting for me to admit I had thrown it. But I hadn't. I looked past them into the trees. Something was there. Not an animal. Not a person. A shape too tall, too thin, just standing there watching us. I grabbed my nephew's hand. Time to go. Now. We didn't run. We walked quickly and silently, but behind us, we could hear movement. Branches cracking, leaves rustling. Something was moving alongside us, just beyond the trees. Then suddenly it rushed us. We grabbed the kids and sprinted for the cars. Behind us, the bushes shook violently. Something or many somethings were there, but we didn't stop. We threw our gear into the vehicles, started the engines, and sped down the dirt road. Even as the forest thinned, the tension didn't fade. We kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the tree line, watching us go. Then we saw the bones. They started appearing along the dirt path, scattered at first. A skull here, a ribcage there, but soon there were dozens. Rotting carcasses, stripped bones, the remains of deer, raccoons, rabbits. Some were fresh. Others had been there for a long time. The stench of decay filled the air, seeping into the car. We swerved to avoid running over them, but they stretched for nearly a mile. Then we saw it, a rusted-out yellow school bus, abandoned in a clearing just off the road. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I thought someone was camping there and needed a warning. I stepped out of the truck. The bus was in ruins, flat tires, newspaper-covered windows, strange symbols carved into the peeling paint. Nearby, a massive fire pit, 20 feet across and deep. Inside it, bones, more than I could count. Some bleached white, others still clinging with flesh. Hanging from the trees around the pit, small animal carcasses, tied with string. I felt something watching me. I turned back to the truck, my stomach twisting. My wife's face was pale, her eyes wide as she silently urged me to get back inside. I didn't hesitate. We caught up with my brother-in-law's car and drove the rest of the way in silence, never looking back. We don't know who or what was out there, and we don't want to know. All we know is that something was watching us from the trees. My brother and I had gone camping. It was a gorgeous, warm, and clear day, ideal for a hike in the countryside. When we returned to our campsite, we noticed a car struggling to back in a brand new compact camper. It wasn't unusual. Honestly, I'd had my fair share of trouble maneuvering one myself. The last thing I'd want in that moment was a crowd of onlookers offering tips, so we left them to it. About 45 minutes later, everything had changed. I was out walking my dog when I neared that section of the campground and saw flashing emergency lights. A group of people had gathered, with police and firefighters on the scene. Something bad had happened. I wasn't the type to linger, so I turned around. That's when another camper, a woman I didn't know, came up to me. "Did you hear what happened?" she asked. Before I could respond, she launched into the story. It had been their first time taking the camper out. 3 generations of a family. A grandmother, her daughter, and a little girl, hoping for a fun weekend. But they had picked a site with a steep incline leading to a lower, flatter section. And they made a terrible mistake. They unhitched the camper while it was still on the slope, without positioning it correctly. Worse, they forgot to block the wheels. Gravity took over immediately. The camper rolled backward, picking up speed fast. In a panic, the grandmother tried to stop it, but a 1,000-pound trailer isn't something a person can hold back. It knocked her over instantly, dragging her downhill with it. The camper didn't stop until it crashed into the trees below. But by then, the damage was done. By the time first responders arrived, the grandmother was in critical condition. I later found out she had multiple fractures and serious internal injuries. They stabilized her at a nearby hospital, but she had to be airlifted to a major trauma center. When the scene finally cleared, I walked past again. The campsite was taped off, 2 park rangers standing by their vehicles, watching over what remained. Days later, the compact camper was still there, stuck in the trees like a silent wreckage. Let this be a warning, always secure your trailer. Deep in the hills, we planned to stay for a few nights. The first night was perfect. We found a good clearing, safely built a fire, and settled into complete calm. The second night, though, that's when everything went wrong. As the sun dipped behind the trees, we heard it. A bear. It was distant, moving through an open patch of forest. We could hear its snapping branches, its heavy footsteps crunching through the brush. We weren't worried. We'd grown up knowing how to deal with bears. Keep food secured, make noise, and they usually leave you alone. But after nightfall, it got closer. At first, we only heard it at the tree line, slow, careful steps that made our skin prickle. We grabbed some rocks and shouted, hoping to scare it off, but it didn't work. The footsteps kept coming, heavier now, then more of them. Not just 1, not 2, at least 3. The sounds surrounded us. Leaves rustling, twigs breaking, coming in from all directions. We held our breath, gripping our flashlights, straining to see movement beyond the glow of the fire. The darkness was too thick. Then, from somewhere just beyond the trees, we heard it. A growl. People think they know what a bear sounds like. They don't. This wasn't a normal growl. It was deep, powerful. Something I felt in my chest before I even heard it in my ears. It wasn't just low. It carried the strange, eerie tone, almost like a train whistle buried under something ancient and raw. A sound I've never heard before or since. Then another growl to our left. Then another behind us. We moved without thinking, no discussion, no hesitation. We packed up as fast as we could, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. The fire wasn't even fully out when we grabbed our gear and ran. What had taken us 2 days to hike up, we covered in 3 hours. I kept glancing back, expecting to see something. Eyes, movement, a shape in the dark. But there was nothing. Just the feeling that something was still there, watching, following. By the time we reached the base of the hills, we were drenched in sweat, out of breath and trembling. We stumbled into a small roadside campground around 2 a.m., so dehydrated we had to steal water from a garden hose. We could have knocked on a door and asked for help, but we didn't, because even then we still felt it, that sense that whatever was up there wasn't finished with us. I don't know if it was bears. I don't know if it was something worse. I just know we were never meant to make it out. Last year, my friends and I went hiking and camping in the Carpathians. Mountains, a place that feels like it belongs in an old myth. Towering peaks loomed in the distance, dense woods swallowed the daylight, and the air carried the weight of a land untouched by time. It was breathtaking, but in that eerie, unsettling way that makes your skin prickle, like unseen eyes are watching. We set up camp close to a stream, a seemingly perfect spot, except for one odd detail. The ground was absolutely covered in cow dung. It was everywhere, but in the Tatras, that wasn't anything unusual. The locals often sent their cattle up to graze during the summer, so we didn't give it much thought. We cooked, chatted, and eventually dozed off beneath the cold, star-filled sky. Then morning arrived. I woke to the distant sound of heavy hooves striking the earth. At first, it was steady, almost soothing. But then came the deep, guttural bellows, low, throaty noises that sent a strange chill down my spine. By the time I unzipped my tent, I saw them. A massive herd of cows had surrounded our campsite, their dark, empty eyes fixed on us. And among them he stood, a monstrous white bull. Muscles rippled beneath his hide, like something carved from marble. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, nostrils flaring as he stared, unblinking. At first he did nothing, just watched. But there was something off about him, too still, too focused. We moved carefully, trying not to startle him, but it was obvious he didn't want us there. His ears pinned back, and he stomped the ground once, twice. Then, without warning, he charged. He plowed into one of the tents, flattening it instantly. Metal poles snapped like twigs. The person inside barely managed to roll out in time, scrambling away as the bull turned and rammed the wreckage again, dragging it several feet before tossing it aside like it weighed nothing. We yelled, waved our arms, tried everything to scare him off, but he didn't even flinch. He paced, snorting, eyes locked on us with something that felt wrong. This wasn't just mindless aggression. It was deliberate, a challenge. And so the waiting game began. For 4 agonizing hours, we barely moved as the beast stood his ground. If we so much as shifted in the wrong direction, his head would lower, muscles tensing like a coiled spring, ready to strike again. We couldn't fight him, couldn't outrun him, and we sure as hell couldn't scare him. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, the herd began to drift away, and with them, the bull. But even as he left, he kept glancing back, slowly, deliberately, as if daring us to follow. We packed up and left in silence. That night, huddled around a different campfire miles away, we joked about it, trying to shake off the unease. But none of us slept well, because in the stillness of the mountains, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still hear those hooves. It was 2019, a year when everything felt slow and uneventful. My family and I were stuck at home in Arizona, desperate for anything to break the boredom. My parents came up with an idea. Why not camp in the backyard for a change? It sounded fun, something different, and I was all for it. We were fully committed to sleeping outside until just after dinner when my younger brother suddenly said he wasn't feeling well. My parents took it as a sign, and just like that, our little outdoor adventure was scrapped. We all went to bed around 10:45 p.m., safely inside the house, unaware that staying indoors had just saved our lives. The spot we had planned to set up our tents was on the left side of our house, near a strange section of the yard that lined up perfectly with an intersection. Every now and then, we'd hear cars racing down the road late at night, but it had never been more than an occasional irritation, just background noise. But that night, around 12:15 a.m., the usual sound of passing cars turned into something much worse. The sharp screech of tires cut through the quiet, followed by the horrifying crunch of metal twisting, snapping, and something heavy slamming into an unmovable force. The sound was so violent that it yanked me out of my sleep, my heart pounding as I struggled to make sense of it in my half-awake state. At first, I brushed it off as some reckless driver losing control. But when my parents started shouting for my brother and me to come downstairs, I knew something was seriously wrong. Their voices weren't just urgent, they were panicked. I ran down the stairs with my brother right behind me, and the moment we stepped onto the porch, my stomach sank. Below us, the fence had been completely destroyed, not just damaged but leveled. And sitting in the wreckage, its front half exactly where we had planned to sleep, was a smashed-up car. If we had gone through with our plan, we would have been lying there in our sleeping bags when it came crashing through. Then, the driver flicked on the car's interior light, and for the first time, I saw him. He was thin, unkempt, with dark, messy hair, probably in his late 20s. Something about him felt wrong. His head lolled forward, then snapped up suddenly, as if he had just realized he had an audience. My parents kept their voices calm but firm, trying to talk to him without setting him off. My dad murmured for my brother and me to stay quiet, and we did, though I could feel my brother trembling beside me. For a few moments, the man just sat there, staring blankly like he wasn't entirely aware of his surroundings. Then, out of nowhere, he stumbled out of the car and started moving toward us. His steps were uneven, but there was purpose behind them, something wild and unpredictable. His words were slurred, a mess of mumbled nonsense, but as he got closer, his voice grew louder, more erratic. I gripped the porch railing, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mom whispered something to my dad, and I could hear the fear in her voice. Just as the man reached the bottom of the porch steps, flashing red and blue lights filled the yard. A police car pulled up fast, its doors swinging open as two officers stepped out, instantly taking in the situation. One officer cut the man off before he could get any closer, sitting him down and trying to get him to talk. The other went to check the wrecked car, shining a flashlight inside. Then he froze. He called out to his partner, and both officers immediately stiffened. The driver was either too intoxicated to notice or simply didn't care. He kept muttering to himself, lost in whatever state he was in. It wasn't until the next morning that I learned the truth. My parents sat me down and explained that when the officer searched the car, he found a loaded gun. If things had played out differently, if he had perceived us as a threat, if he had been even slightly more unstable, I don't want to think about what could have happened. But the scariest realization was knowing that if my brother hadn't backed out, if we had gone through with camping, we never would have seen it coming. We would have been lying there, bundled up in our sleeping bags, whispering stories and laughing, completely oblivious to the headlights speeding toward us at nearly 100 miles per hour, wrapped up like little human burritos, seconds away from being wiped out by a drunk driver. We wouldn't have had time to move, to react, to do anything. A place we used to explore as kids was hidden deep in the woods, tucked away like a forgotten relic. The ruins of an old structure stood there, maybe a house, maybe something else. The walls, made of cracked and crumbling concrete, reached about chest height. No roof, no ceiling, just the skeletal remains of whatever it had once been, tangled in vines and overgrown with weeds. One afternoon, 4 of us decided to make it ours. We weren't just exploring this time, we were building something. Armed with a hatchet, a machete, and some pocket knives, we got to work like little survivalists, chopping through the brush and clearing the space around the structure. Nearby, there was a round pit in the ground, half filled with bricks. Maybe it had been a well, maybe an old silo, we had no idea. But we felt like we were claiming the place, making it our own. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, we had a fire going inside the walls. The flames danced against the weathered concrete, the air thick with the scent of burning wood. We sat around, talking, laughing, feeling like kings of our own little ruin. Then I had to take a crap. Not the best timing, considering we were in the middle of the woods, but my friend's house wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk at most. I had made the trip dozens of times before, so I wasn't worried. Grabbing a flashlight, I set off alone, the firelight shrinking behind me. About halfway there, I heard footsteps. Not the scurrying of an animal, not the distant snap of a branch. Footsteps. I stopped. The sound stopped. A cold, Heavy feelings settled in my chest. I took another step. The footsteps followed. Someone or something was matching my movements. My skin prickled, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned back, walking faster, my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. When I finally saw the firelight again, relief washed over me. As I stepped back inside the ruins, my friends glanced up. "Back already?" one of them asked. I hesitated, my throat dry. I think someone's out there." They stared at me, waiting for the joke. Then we all heard it. A sound just outside the walls. A metallic clang, like something striking concrete, sharp, hollow, deliberate. It sounded like someone had dropped an empty can. We froze. Every hair on my body stood up. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, all at once, we snapped into action. We threw water on the fire, smothering the flames as fast as we could. Darkness swallowed the ruins. Without a word, we squeezed through a break in the wall, avoiding the main entrance. We took the harder, overgrown path through the thicket. It was faster. Branches scraped at our clothes as we pushed through, trying not to stumble. Behind us, we heard it. Something moving, twigs snapping, footsteps, steady and deliberate. We burst onto the road, gasping for breath, hearts racing. And then we saw him. A figure stepped out of the trees. A man in a hoodie. He just stood there watching us. We didn't wait. We didn't speak. We just kept moving, never looking back. And we really, really hope we never see that guy again. A friend told me this story, and whenever I think about it, a deep chill still runs through me. This happened on a quiet weekday. My friend and his teammates, a group of dedicated researchers, had planned a field study in a wooded area not far from town. Though technically part of the city outskirts, the forest remained secluded and untouched. Towering trees stretched high, blocking most of the sky, while birdsong echoed through the crisp air. It was a perfect day for a short camping trip. Safe enough, especially with joggers, cyclists, and the occasional hiker passing by. Their goal was straightforward: gather samples, document plant species, and record data for their research. They had everything they needed: cameras, laptops, field journals, and collection tools. As they followed a lesser-known trail, the atmosphere was almost peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the leaves, casting shifting shadows on the ground. Conversations flowed easily, their laughter blending with the rustling foliage. But calm moments like that can be deceiving, making people unaware of what's lurking beneath the surface. It started subtly, a flicker of movement just beyond their vision, something shifting between the trees. Then, two men stepped onto the path. They didn't seem dangerous at first. No masks, no signs of panic, just two ordinary-looking strangers moving without urgency. But then, one of them reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Everything changed. "Hand over everything," the man barked, his voice sharp and edged with menace. No hesitation, no false pretense, just raw threat. The researchers froze. Their months of work, their valuable equipment, none of it mattered anymore. One by one, they obeyed, their hands shaking as they surrendered their belongings. Cameras, phones, wallets, and laptops. Then one of my friend's colleagues, a young woman, had a panic attack. She gasped for air, her fingers curling into empty space, tears spilling down her face. But the thieves showed no sympathy. If anything, her distress only made them more aggressive. The worst part was the bystanders, the joggers, the cyclists, the hikers, people who saw, who noticed. Some hesitated for a second but quickly turned away, choosing to disappear down another path rather than get involved. No one stepped in. No one called for help. The robbery lasted only minutes, but fear made it feel endless. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the men were gone, vanishing into the trees. Only silence remained, a hollow, sickening emptiness where their possessions used to be. For a long moment, no one spoke. They just stood there, their breathing unsteady, their faces drained of color. The weight of what had just happened settled over them. They gathered what little remained. Luckily, the thieves hadn't taken the car keys. The walk back to the parking lot felt unreal, like moving through a nightmare they hadn't woken up from. Once back in town, they went straight to the police. But even as they filed the report, they knew the truth. Their stolen gear was gone for good. The odds of getting justice? Next to nothing. But it wasn't just the loss of their equipment that stayed with them. It was the feeling of being hunted, of realizing how fast safety can disappear. That forest, once a place of curiosity and wonder, was now marked by something else. A lingering unease, a scar left behind. Because danger doesn't always come with a warning. Sometimes it just steps out of the trees, and no one is there to stop it. Whenever I think about it, a deep chill still runs through me. This happened on a quiet weekday. My friend and his teammates, a group of dedicated researchers, had planned a field study in a wooded area not far from town. Though technically part of the city outskirts, the forest remained secluded and untouched. Towering trees stretched high, blocking most of the sky, while birdsong echoed through the crisp air. It was a perfect day for a short camping trip. Safe enough, especially with joggers, cyclists, and the occasional hiker passing by. Their goal was straightforward: gather samples, document plant species, and record data for their research. They had everything they needed: cameras, laptops, field journals, and collection tools. As they followed a lesser-known trail, the atmosphere was almost peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the leaves, casting shifting shadows on the ground. Conversations flowed easily, their laughter blending with the rustling foliage. But calm moments like that can be deceiving, making people unaware of what's lurking beneath the surface. It started subtly, a flicker of movement just beyond their vision, something shifting between the trees. Then, two men stepped onto the path. They didn't seem dangerous at first. No masks, no signs of panic, just two ordinary-looking strangers moving without urgency. But then, one of them reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Everything changed. "Hand over everything," the man barked, his voice sharp and edged with menace. No hesitation, no false pretense, just raw threat. The researchers froze. Their months of work, their valuable equipment, none of it mattered anymore. One by one, they obeyed, their hands shaking as they surrendered their belongings. Cameras, phones, wallets, and laptops. Then one of my friend's colleagues, a young woman, had a panic attack. She gasped for air, her fingers curling into empty space, tears spilling down her face. But the thieves showed no sympathy. If anything, her distress only made them more aggressive. The worst part was the bystanders, the joggers, the cyclists, the hikers, people who saw, who noticed. Some hesitated for a second but quickly turned away, choosing to disappear down another path rather than get involved. No one stepped in. No one called for help. The robbery lasted only minutes, but fear made it feel endless. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the men were gone, vanishing into the trees. Only silence remained, a hollow, sickening emptiness where their possessions used to be. For a long moment, no one spoke. They just stood there, their breathing unsteady, their faces drained of color. The weight of what had just happened settled over them. They gathered what little remained. Luckily, the thieves hadn't taken the car keys. The walk back to the parking lot felt unreal, like moving through a nightmare they hadn't woken up from. Once back in town, they went straight to the police. But even as they filed the report, they knew the truth. Their stolen gear was gone for good. The odds of getting justice? Next to nothing. But it wasn't just the loss of their equipment that stayed with them. It was the feeling of being hunted, of realizing how fast safety can disappear. That forest, once a place of curiosity and wonder, was now marked by something else. A lingering unease, a scar left behind. Because danger doesn't always come with a warning. Sometimes it just steps out of the trees, and no one is there to stop it. I don't even know how to begin this, but I need to tell you about something that happened one night on a camping trip. Something I still can't explain. A few friends and I had planned a trip deep into the forest. You know how we love finding those isolated spots where no one else is around. We're the outdoorsy type. We set up our tents, built a fire, and just relaxed, talking, laughing, and soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. The plan was simple: unwind, gaze at the stars, and maybe catch a glimpse of some wildlife if we were lucky. Everything was perfect. You could hear the chirping of insects, the crackling flames, the wind moving through the trees. It was the ideal camping night, until suddenly we heard it, a scream. It was, without a doubt, the most unsettling scream I've ever heard. It sounded like a woman, but something about it was wrong, twisted, almost unnatural, as if it was distorted somehow. I know what mountain lions sound like, and this wasn't one. We all froze. Nobody wanted to admit they were scared, but I could see it in their faces. And then we heard the footsteps. They were heavy, too heavy, like whatever was walking was big. But something about the way it moved wasn't right. It had an odd rhythm, like it was dragging one of its legs or limping. One of my friends tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a bear. But even he didn't sound convinced. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to pretend it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching us. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. At first, all I saw were shifting shadows and swaying branches. But then I spotted it. Tail. Long, thin, covered in tangled, filthy fur. My stomach turned. I held the beam steady, and that's when I saw more of it. Something was moving between the trees. I couldn't see its full shape, just glimpses, flashes of something that didn't seem entirely right. A leg or something resembling a leg. But it wasn't fully animal. It wasn't fully human either. It looked wrong, twisted. The entire group went silent. The thing stepped closer to our campsite, but it made no sound except for its breathing, ragged, slow, almost like a deep, steady growl. None of us dared to move. We just sat there, gripping whatever we could use as a weapon, staring into the darkness. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The thing just paced at the edge of our firelight, like it was looking for something. Then, without warning, it was gone. One moment it was there, and the next it wasn't. As soon as dawn broke, we packed up in record time. Before leaving, I went to check the area where it had been lurking. That's when I saw the tracks. Claw marks, deep ones, huge, like they belonged to a massive animal. But right next to them, footprints. Not quite human, not quite animal. They were deformed, like someone had tried to shape a person's foot but got it horribly wrong. I haven't been able to shake that night from my mind. The scream still lingers in my head, and I've spent hours comparing it to known animal calls. Nothing matches. And even now, when I'm alone at night, sometimes, I swear I can still hear it. It was early October when my friends and I, a group of 4, decided to take a weekend camping trip in a secluded part of Sierra Valley Forest. We had been planning for weeks, looking forward to the crisp air, autumn colors, and an escape from cell service. The plan was simple: hike about 10 miles in, camp by a lake, and hike back the following day. Everything seemed straightforward until it wasn't. Less than an hour into the trail, we encountered a man. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing worn-out hiking boots and jeans, with a small backpack slung over one shoulder. First, he seemed friendly. He asked if we were heading to the waterfalls, something we had heard about but hadn't planned to visit since it wasn't on the main path. When we said no, he told us he'd just been there. "It's beautiful," he said, "but the best way to get there is an unmarked trail about half a mile ahead. You can't miss it, way better than the main route." We thanked him and kept walking, but something about him unsettled us. Even after we said goodbye, he lingered, watching us. My friend Emily muttered that he was giving off weird vibes, and we laughed it off, though she didn't seem to shake the uneasy feeling. When we reached the unmarked trail, it was barely visible, a narrow dirt path winding into the trees. Despite a nagging feeling in my gut, we decided to take it. The waterfalls sounded amazing, and the man had spoken so confidently about the shortcut. At first, the trail was manageable, but as we went further, it became rougher. Steep, rocky, and difficult to navigate. After about 20 minutes, something felt off. The path looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. No footprints, no signs of people. That's when we spotted a small stack of rocks. A cairn, placed right in the middle of the trail. It looked freshly made. Jake joked that it felt like something out of a horror movie, but no one laughed. The mood had shifted. Felt like we weren't alone. When the trail started fading into thick trees, Emily was the first to say what we were all thinking. We should turn around. This doesn't feel right. We all agreed and started heading back. Then we saw it. Another cairn, identical to the first, sitting in the middle of the path. But none of us remembered passing it before. Someone had put it there while we were walking. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. My heart, however, was pounding. We started moving faster. Jake pulled out his phone to check GPS, but of course, there was no signal. That's when we heard it. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping, just off the trail. We froze. Emily whispered, "Probably just an animal." Then we saw him, the man from earlier, standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree. This time, he wasn't smiling. Jake called out, trying to sound casual. "Hey man, we're just heading back to the main trail." The man didn't reply. He just stood there watching us. Then two other men stepped out from behind nearby trees, both holding machetes. "Drop your bags," the first man ordered, his voice cold and firm. My stomach sank. None of us moved. We were too shocked to react. One of the other men stepped closer, waving his knife. "We don't want trouble. Just drop your packs and leave," he said. Jake whispered, "Run." I let go of my backpack before taking off. I had never run so fast in my life. Branches scraped my face, but I didn't care. Behind us, I could hear them yelling, their heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. At one point, I felt a hand grab at my jacket. Somehow, we made it back to the main trail. I don't know how, but we did. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. The only vehicles there were ours, and an old, rusted pickup truck with no license plates. We wasted no time. We jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped away without looking back. We reported the incident to local authorities, but they never got back to us. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't turned back when we did. One last piece of advice: download your maps before heading into the wilderness. And whatever you do, never take unmarked trails. Most importantly, don't trust strangers.